Dave Hall, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. This is really exciting.
All right, so you are a primitivist, wilderness survival guy, and you've just come out with a book about winter survival. But before we get into the book and some of the principles of surviving in the winter, let's talk about how did you get involved or get started with wilderness survival and primitive skills training?
Sure. Well, I think like a lot of people, I came up through the ranks in kind of that very typical way. I was an avid Boy Scout. I loved camping. I loved canoeing. And our Scoutmaster really provided those kind of amazing experiences. So, really typically, meaning I was into the backpacking and all the gear and all those wilderness experiences that kind of gave you a nice adrenaline rush. And long story short was that eventually put me in a place where I was professionally leading people, mostly youth groups, through the Adirondacks. And up until that point, all of my, quote, guiding was just like with friends and all that. But something shifted in my mind that once I was getting paid, I felt, I guess, really a little dependent on the gear. I really wasn't able to answer those questions like, what if a bear walks off with my food? What if the canoe sinks? What if the stove falls apart? Any number of things can and do happen, and I had no capability of really answering that, those questions. So that, kind of serendipitously, my first group that I ever led through this program called Adirondack Treks led me to wilderness survival because this young man named Will mentioned the Tracker School, and that's Tom Brown's school down in New Jersey. And it really sounded like a great place for me to, learn, I think, what I was craving, And so that's where it really all started. So I began, picking up some of Tom's books, and then I eventually went down and took a class, and, the rest is history kind of thing.
Gotcha. So besides doing the leaded guides in the outdoors, you also have a school that I thought was just, it sounds awesome. When I read about it, I was like, I got to send my kids this when they get older. It's called Primitive Pursuits. Can you tell us why you started this? It's a camp or program to teach primitive skills to kids.
Yeah, so it was about 1999. I began working for Cornell Cooperative Extension, which is the organization that houses 4-H. And I've been working with youth through that program for, roughly 16 years now. And as one of my after-school programs, I thought, well, let's see how the kids respond to my enthusiasm for learning these kind of really nature-based approaches to wilderness survival. And so really, very organically, Primitive Pursuits began as an after-school program, and then through the effort of friends of mine, they took the idea and grew it into this huge program that is much more in the public eye now. And so right now it's probably the biggest wilderness skills program of its sort in the Northeast. We work with all ages. They're talking about doing a residential program for adults. It's pretty amazing. And I think, and I was talking to somebody about this recently, when I say we, there was a core bunch of us at the beginning. I think we offered a program that somehow deep down really resonated with people. We weren't trying to pitch, whatever, canning sauerkraut, which may have value. We were really saying, hey, we want to bring you into a place where you're kind of in touch with nature, you're more capable, you're more in tune with the natural rhythms, you're able to, do any number of things, and it's simply based on a really strong and deep, meaningful connection with nature, kind of minus the gadgets and gear. So,
and yeah. what's the response to kids who are, they're like, the kids who are glued to their screens? I mean, they can't have that stuff out there. I mean, what's been the response? Are there sort of like the withdrawals at first and they love it, or they love it just from the get-go?
I would say overwhelmingly the response is positive. We certainly know that kids today are plugged in way more than they should be, and they have a tough time managing the technology that's offered to them. But when we get them outside, there's something so different, so raw and pure and fun that, they just can't help but feel excited about life once they get involved with the program. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a win-win for everybody because
Gotcha.
we're having fun teaching, we're learning along with them a lot of the time, and and parents just come back with amazing comments, and it's just a wonderful program.
Awesome. What are your tips for parents who, they don't live near Cornell, like me? Like I read about this, and I'm like, man, that's really far. It's going to take 3 planes to get over there. But if they want the same sort of thing for their kids, like what can they do to
Hmm.
replicate something like Primitive Pursuits in their own hometown?
Sure. Well, I have to say that it's not rocket science in the sense that I think if you're honest with the kids about where your own skill levels are at, and you treat it as like, let's learn and do this together, you don't have to necessarily be an expert. It certainly helps to have kind of at least a foundation in basic survival priorities so you don't get yourself in trouble. But at the same time, you could be like, pick up one of the good books, Tom Brown's book, my book, a lot of good stuff out there, and just start learning together and have fun, and don't make it try to be anti, school, like classroom. Have it be fun, making it adventure. And so, I think, and leave room for kids to have unstructured, just creative time where they feel like they're directing themselves. So even if you're not an expert per se at these skills, it doesn't mean that you can't start on that path.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Great. That's awesome.
yeah.
Great advice. Okay. So talk about your book, Winter in the Wilderness. Cause I've read a lot of survival books, but a lot of them, I feel like they assume that you're going to be like in the woods in the summer or spring or fall, like where there's some inclement weather, but you don't have to deal with the very extreme cold. So I'm curious, what's the biggest mistake people typically make whenever they approach survival in the winter that perhaps, it wouldn't be a problem if it was summertime or springtime, but becomes a problem if it's snowy and it's cold?
Yeah, well, really, I think people don't have kind of a raw understanding of the potential of what can go wrong. It can, right? You're exactly right. The implications of a summer situation don't compare to anything that the winter may throw at you, right? And simply not anticipating the worst case scenarios, and also not understanding what your body's priorities are gets people into trouble. They don't know where to direct their energy so that they can actually take care of themselves. There was that story. It was in 2006, the James Kim story, where he and his family got stuck up on some mountain road in Oregon. And they basically sat it out for a few days. They got stuck in the snow, and it wasn't an SUV type; it was a smaller car. But when the food and the gas ran out of the car, Mr. Kim left, presumably to head back down to the main road from where they came. But it was hypothermia that did him in. He got cold. He didn't have an inherent respect and understanding of how to deal with that and what could happen if he didn't do things right. And he was found, within the week. He had gotten off trail, circled around, and, he hadn't taken care of himself or didn't know how, and hypothermia got the best of him. So in his case, it was a very noble effort, but he just didn't know how to deal with it.
Yeah. So in the winter, your top priority
yeah.
should be staying warm, right?
Yes, number one is staying warm. And if you think about it, there are so many different things that you can do to help maintain your warmth, whether it's making sure you're dressed right, making sure you're full of good calories, making sure you're, maybe you're building a shelter or a fire. Any number of things can be done that can help to preserve and insulate yourself.
Gotcha. We'll get into some specifics about that, but let's talk about hypothermia, because it's one of those things people talk about a lot. But when I was reading your book, I was like, I don't think I knew what the symptoms of hypothermia were. Like if it was happening to me, I don't know if that it would be happening to me. So what are the symptoms of hypothermia that that, okay, I need to take action now?
That's right. And it's really, this is the thing where like being in tune with your body and knowing, your body's giving you clues as to something's happening. And the first clue, and this is not like a panic situation, but the first clue that you're losing core temperature is you're simply shivering, right? That's your body's effort. It's literally vibrating to try to warm itself up. But it's not a panic situation, but that is your moment to act, because as soon as you go into a deeper level of hypothermia, you may utterly be useless to yourself, and the symptoms are all over the place. You might have slurred speech, your body may go rigid, you may stumble. But what happens, and it's happened to me once, and I'm sort of glad in a way so I can talk about it from firsthand experience, is that, after you shiver, you can literally go rigid, meaning you stop shivering, you kind of get stiff, and your brain goes numb. And that's why you hear stories about hikers or hunters, and they drop their clothing. They don't act rationally, right? And it's just a downward spiral. So really the thing for most people to understand is like, okay, I'm shivering. It's time to improve my situation, because after that, the symptoms are kind of interesting to know, but they may be moot for the actual survivalist in the thick of things.
Yeah. And so treating it, it's getting warm, right? Like getting dry and warm.
Yes, right. It might mean putting on an extra layer. It might be getting out of damp things and getting into warm things. Do jumping jacks for a little while. It's energy intensive, but it might be what you need for that moment. Make a fire, make some hot tea, any number of things. Get out of the wind, don't sit on the snow, that kind of anything sensible like that. Yep.
Yeah, I thought one of the interesting tips was don't stay in valleys because that's where the cold air sinks.
Right.
Right.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I never would have thought of that.
Get up off the floor of the valley, just even a little, and you'll feel it. You'll feel it when you get up above it. It's really interesting.
Interesting. And what about? Is frostbite? What's worse, frostbite or hypothermia? Like, should you be more worried about hypothermia? I'm assuming.
Definitely, yeah. Like frostbite is not simply. It's certainly something you want to avoid, but that's like frozen skin, frozen body parts. But it doesn't necessarily imply that you have lost core temperature. Okay. Right. You certainly don't want to lose fingers and nose pieces, but it's hypothermia that is more dangerous.
So if keeping your core body temperature up is the top priority, what's your suggestions for dressing to maximize survival in the wilderness? Because I get the catalogs for the outdoor mag stuff, and I subscribe to Outdoor Magazine. I see all these cool synthetic fabrics and awesome ski jackets and coats. Are those necessarily the best thing to have when you're dressing for the cold?
Sure. So the first thing to do is avoid cotton at all costs, okay? Because what happens is cotton, when it gets wet, it actually sucks heat away from you. So dress in layers of synthetics, and wools are the best. I tend to go with wools a lot because, this whole survival game implies that I'm going to be around fire quite a bit. And synthetics have a very low melting point. So you'll end up with, garments that end up with, little pock marks all over them because they've gotten melted. And, wool is durable and it's quiet and it tends to be in earthy tones. I also do, I'm not saying don't use the Gore-Tex and that stuff. I do use, a good Gore-Tex shell. But what layers does is it gives you the ability to take off things to regulate your body heat, because this may seem funny, but if you're being active, you actually want to stay on the cool side because you don't want to sweat from the inside out and get your clothes wet, right? And because once you cool down, you can literally have ice build up between your layers. It's one thing if you're out ice fishing and you want to put on the biggest down parka you can find because you're just going to be sedentary. But really, for most of us, working with layers of clothes is a much better option. I rarely wear, a big, heavy jacket. I don't even think I own one.
Gotcha.
The closest thing I have is like a heavy down jacket type thing, sweater.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about footwear?
Yeah. And I was going to say, so most of these things, like in terms of clothing, you don't necessarily have to spend a lot of money on. You can go to the thrift shop, you can go to a secondhand store. But the two places where I don't skimp is footwear and gloves. And in terms of footwear, I want people to know, if you're uncomfortable in your feet, that's not only dangerous, but it's just kind of going to make for a really lousy experience. And so I go with boots that are built to withstand, negative 20, negative 30 degrees. They have to have removable liners because that enables you to dry them out. Your feet tend to perspire quite a little bit. And make sure they're well built. Invest a little bit of money. I have a pair of lacrosse Icemans that I've literally been using for 25 years, and they are still going strong. Nice. Which is an amazing feat. And then for gloves, because you're working, breaking branches and you're moving a lot of material, I find that your typical high-end, REI or North Face type gloves, even though they're great for skiing and a lot of things, they don't hold up to like the abuse that you're going to be putting them through. So I go with leather, waxed leather mittens with insulated leather glove inside of them, and that double layering system works well. And
awesome.
They hold up.
All right, so
yeah, they don't have some like. Yep.
Very good. So bottom line, cotton is rotten.
Yes, that's right. Cotton kills.
Cotton kills. Okay.
Yep.
So let's talk about, okay, so in keeping with this idea of priority being keeping warm, how do you build a fire in the snow, right? Because that's the thing,
sure.
Whenever I go camping, I get so, the fire is the one thing I take a lot of pride in, and it's easy when it's warm and dry and everything's perfect, but when it's wet, that's where I'm like, man, how do you get a fire going when everything is wet?
Right, and you're exactly right. When you need fire the most is when it's hardest to make, right? And let's even one up that. What is like the worst case scenario in terms of winter survival? It's not when there's nice, fluffy, deep snow. It's actually when the weather warms up a bit, it's hovering somewhere around freezing, and it starts to rain and everything gets soaked, right? That is like your worst case scenario, and that is probably going to be a better option for fire rather than, say, a snow shelter. Right. So what do? Everything is literally soaked. There's nothing on the ground that's useful. And so I came up with this little system called the fire burrito. And and this is where, as a survivalist or somebody who's interested in these skills, you have to start opening your eyes and looking for your resources. And the core of the fire burrito is what I call punky wood. You have to find trees that are in a state of rot that offer you material that's kind of dry, spongy. It will take a flame or an ember from a friction set really well, and then you put that on a slab of bark, and you get it going, put twigs on top, another lid of bark, and that will light itself. And you get to the dry stuff by finding the right trees and pulling away all of the wet stuff, all of the stuff that's been precipitated on. And it's an amazing little device. You can direct people to the website and they can see a video of that. But yeah, literally a lifesaver. It's amazing.
That's awesome.
Very potent.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I went out. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, we'll put a link to it for sure.
Yeah. Well, so it was a day after Hurricane Sandy came through this area. There was no school the next day, and I ended up in the state forest near my house. Everything is just soaked, saturated, and I, without really thinking about it, found a proper tree, created a fire burrito, and I actually had trouble putting that fire out in an environment that had just been, dumped on. Wow. So it's a very potent way. Yeah, but, I do have to say that making fire and being so good at that skill is one of the most important skills that anybody can master, because when there aren't other options, fire is going to save your butt.
Yeah. And
that's by actually, even though I'm a big advocate of the primitive, always carry at least a couple modern methods to light your fire. Don't mess around in the winter.
Yeah, and that
always carry.
That's a skill that you can practice at home. Like, you don't have to necessarily be out camping to practice making fires, right?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, I even though I'm really good at this stuff, I am always kind of monkeying with different flammable materials and trying to make fires in new ways or challenging myself. If we've had a weather event and going out and just proving to myself yet again that I can do it, always kind of staying on top of things that way. Yep.
All right. So along this line, keeping warm, shelter. So this is usually the priorities is isn't it fire, shelter?
Yeah, in the book, how we arranged it was, we certainly talked about clothing, but we decided to put fire at first before shelter, and simply for the reason of helping people understand those really bad worst-case scenario situations, because they can happen anytime. And even though I'm in New York State, which most people think of as a very wintry state, it hasn't been like that in the last 10 years. We're getting weather events that are very fickle. One day it's above freezing, the next day it's not. One day it's snowing, the next day it's raining. And so these situations that are really horrific are becoming more common, in my opinion, So what we did was clothing, fire, and then we got into shelter.
All right. So let's talk about building shelters with the snow. So most people, when they think about snow shelters, they'll probably think like the igloo, right? The blocks of snow. But you actually talk about the just like a big mound of snow, and then you hollow it out. What's the name of that system again?
Sure, that's a Quincy, and that's kind of a classic North Country shelter, and it really is an amazing thing. If you can imagine that kind of ideal postcard snow, it's light and fluffy, and it doesn't make good snowballs because it's too cold out. What do you do with that, right? And so what's interesting is that snow of that quality, when it is moved, either by, a person or by nature, meaning it drifts, will become something solid that can be hollowed out. And that, to me, is just one of the most amazing things. What was once just kind of useless fluff is now serving as a sanctuary to me, and that's a fun one. And we've made adaptations from that. That's certainly not my favorite shelter, but they're all good to know because there's a time and a place where, one or another one will be the best choice. But the Quincy is something that I've played with quite a bit and improved upon as well.
And does the purpose of a snow shelter, is it just to keep you away out of the wind, or does it actually get a little warm in there?
Oh yeah, no, it's incredibly valuable. When I say the word sanctuary, it is a true sanctuary. Most snow shelters, actually, I'm going to say all snow shelters, if built properly, are going to heat up simply from your body heat to about 40 degrees, despite temperature outside. So when we were finishing up the book, my co-author, John, who was really helping me write the book, he wasn't as well-versed at these actual skills, and he wanted to go out and experience this, and write about it in the conclusion. And so that particular night, there was a friend who joined us. It was about single digits. I think it got as low as 3 degrees, and we slept out without sleeping bags or blankets. And it's 40 degrees inside. So that's, over a 35-degree difference. If it's 20 below out, the difference is going to be even greater. So it's not only relatively warm, it's quiet, it's cozy, it's just a wonderful place to be, and if you think about the implications of not being there, you could be dead, right?
Yeah.
I mean, not to put a too grim a face on it, but the truth is that it could mean the difference between life and death, which isn't always the angle I'm trying to use when I'm teaching, but in reality, that's what it can do for you.
Yeah. What about instances where you don't have much snow? Like, what is a good go-to shelter to stay warm?
Sure. Well, so if you're asking, like, what do you do when there's no snow, there's really a lot of options. You can utilize fire, use fire in front of a lean-to or a double lean-to or 4 lean-tos together, or basically a shelter. If you don't have fire, you can use something like either a leaf crib or a debris hut, and both of those use basically huge amounts of leaf or forest debris to insulate you, right? And they're just 2 different ways to accomplish that goal. One of the things that we do often is try to emulate animals that can help us in some way. Deer are not, for example, a very good helper in terms of shelter because they can lie there and they have these beautifully dense hollow-haired bodies, covered in these hollow hairs. But a mouse or a squirrel can help us. And so when we utilize leaf litter or grasses to help insulate ourselves, we're really taking a lesson from, those animals. And, that's something you can do. So either with or without fire, the debris hut or a leaf crib is something you can do. It doesn't require any extra heat. It's heated by yourself. Yeah. You're the internal flame.
The leaf crib is just a box, basically, when you just pile in leaves, right?
Yeah. Simply either making some sort of like kind of log cabin type cribbing, or utilizing the landscape so that you have a container. Because if you don't, you make a big pile of leaves, essentially your leaf pile will disperse in the night as you move about. And so that's why you need some sort of container. And incredibly effective, really effective.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about, so, we're keeping warm. We've got shelter. The next priority is water, right? Because a lot of people assume it's food but you can actually go weeks without food, correct?
Yeah, and that's where people get themselves in trouble. We're in such a food-spoiled nation that they think, oh my gosh, where am I going to get my next meal? No, calm down. Yes, you will want food as soon as you can get it, but yeah, you're correct. After maintaining your core temperature, you do want to worry about water in a big way.
Okay. But
Yeah.
I was going to say
Go ahead,
water in
sorry.
the. I was going to say water in the winter poses a challenge, though, right?
It does. Yes. Yep. Yeah, and the challenges are really twofold. For one, you don't want to cool your body's temperature and take away precious calories by ingesting cold or frozen water, right? The other issue is if you do find running water, it will likely need to be boiled to make it safe. So in either case, you want to heat your water. If it's questionable water, you want to boil it. And if it's, something that's coming out of the ground and you feel like you found a reliable spring, it still makes sense to warm it up because otherwise you're going to lose some calories just to getting it up to body temperature, right? And that brings in, an interesting challenge, right? How do you make a container when you're out there, presumably with nothing, to hold and boil water in,
And how do you do that?
So there's two methods that we share. One of them is a simple technology called coal burning. You can imagine, I think most people have heard of the idea of burning out a log to make a canoe. You're basically taking embers and hollowing out a log to make some sort of a vessel. So, of course, a bowl is, theoretically a small burned out canoe type thing. And that doesn't take much other than the use of fire. The other method that we share, and this is only available where the eastern white pine is growing, is you can literally take smooth sections of a branch from an eastern white pine and utilizing heat from a fire, get it to peel off in like a big kind of leathery sheet. And those corners can be pinned to make a seamless container that will hold water and you can boil it in. Of course, the issue is then hopefully it'll become obvious to your listeners as well. How do you utilize something that's basically wood and boil water in it, right?
Yeah.
and the answer is by using heated stones that are then taken out of the fire and put into your vessel, and then you're using heat in the water rather than the typical way that we're all used to heating water.
Interesting. Very clever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So eating snow is a no-no. That's something you don't want to do, like last resort.
Yeah, I mean, if you're just out for the day and you've got an infinite amount of a trail mix, it's not going to hurt you. But if you're really in a situation, don't start wasting precious calories by eating snow.
Gotcha. Okay.
Find a spring or
Yeah. Are there any other skills you think are really important to know, particularly for surviving in the winter?
Well, for me, I'm always asking what if questions, and I think shelter really does epitomize winter survival to me. And so getting out there and practicing in these safe ways is really going to be crucial to anybody who starts to take this topic seriously. There's lots of variety of snow out there. Some of it is going to be more suitable for this shelter, and there's other varieties that are going to be more suitable for that type of shelter. And so really, starting to become more aware and realize that there's lots of variety. Snow, we tend to use descriptors when we talk about snow, like it's sugary, it's powdery, it's sleet, whatever. And you have to find out what's going to work for you in any given situation. For example, the igloo is not something that I have a lot of experience with because I don't live up on the tundra where there's old windswept snow. We get all kinds of the other stuff in central New York. And that sort of led, been actually a great asset to learning because we've just had to face it all. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, in terms of just a particular skill, I don't think there's anything other than saying to your listeners, practice and make it real for yourself. It's one thing to read a book or take a class, but when it really starts to, get into your blood is when you practiced it, and practice safely, I should add,
Yeah. And do you keep the primitive pursuits classes going throughout the winter? Oh,
sure. Yeah. That's actually probably obviously my favorite time of year. Yeah, I love it. And every year we host, an overnight or two when we go out in the winter, and whether there's snow or not, we do it. And last year, it was around New Year's, we didn't have snow, so we kind of had a hodgepodge of camping, situations out there with sleeping bags. But this year, we're gonna wait a little later when the snow is a little more reliable, and we're gonna go out and snow cave it with a bunch of kids. Yep.
Very cool. Well, hey Dave, where can people learn more about your work?
Sure. So my website is davehallprimitive.com, And I should also say that I'm going to be running an adult program this January with Ondatra Adventures. So if anybody's interested in that, they can go to my website and link up to Ondatra.
Very cool. Well, Dave Hall, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Sounds great.
My guest today was Dave Hall. He's the author of the book Winter in the Wilderness, and you can find that on Amazon.com. Also, check out his website, primitivepursuits.com, to learn more about his Primitive Pursuits program in Ithaca, New York.